All right, guys, so today we're going to talk about rescuing our children. And not only rescuing our children, but also thereby rescuing our nation and our freedom. Now, this is a topic that's close to my heart, and I think this is the key battle in the fight for freedom. If we lose on this battle, I think we're going to lose every other battle. And if we win here, we have a real chance at restoring our freedom and restoring our nation and restoring our Constitution and restoring the foundations of our civilization. So it really is that important. So I hope you'll pay close attention. I want to show you just a couple of these polls that have been done, and we'll come back to these before we finish. So you see here that among millennials, and I'm actually really embarrassed to say I'm a millennial. I don't identify as a millennial, but I am one. But you see that only 50% say they absolutely believe in God, and those numbers are declining cataclysmically. 73% of millennials in Generation Z believe that the government should give them their health care. 67%, so more than 2/3, think that the government ought to pay for their college education. They want a free college education. 50% would prefer to live in a socialist country. Can you imagine? What kind of people could prefer to live in a socialist country? And then you have 43%, almost half of millennials in Generation Z, want to abolish ICE, our border protection agency. That's how extreme things are getting. And we need to recognize, as Hitler recognized, as Abraham Lincoln recognized, that the children are the future. And whatever way the children go, that's the way the nation is going to go. So, as Adolf Hitler said, and this is a real quote, I actually went back and looked it up because you get so many fake quotes around. He said, "He alone who owns the youth gains the future." And he's absolutely right. He was wrong about almost everything, but he was absolutely right on this point. Whoever controls the minds of the young people is going to end up controlling the future. And that's why it's so critical that we take this seriously. Here we're going to watch an MSNBC host, one of the far left channels, but still considered relatively mainstream, talking about who the children belong to.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
Notice the children belong to the collective, right? Not to the parents. And the government seems to believe the same thing. We have the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education. They put out a policy paper, and they referred to parents as, quote, equal partners with the government in the rearing of their own children. You can see the document here posted on the federal government's own website. That is the attitude that now permeates our governing institutions. Parents are equal partners at best, kind of pests at worst, who need to be sidelined. This is the ideology that motivates Hillary Clinton as well. She wrote a book about this. The village to raise your children, right? The government village wants to raise your children. Isn't that cute? And we know what a great job government villages do in raising children, right? We could go see Germany prior to World War II, or we could see the Soviet Union or Communist China. Clearly, the government village is doing a great job. And I think this picture here is so iconic. If you don't remember these two children, these are two of the ones who were leading the anti-gun movement, the March for Our Lives. Of course, they had big-time support from George Soros and these foundations and Bloomberg and so on. But the point is, the U.S. government, and as we'll see as we go through this presentation, the United Nations, now controls about 85 to 87% of our children in government schools. So 5 days a week, 6, 7, 8 hours a day, these kids are being indoctrinated with the government's ideology, with the UN's ideology, with the anti-gun nonsense, with the globalism, with the socialism, with the anti-border. So this is our future if we don't recognize and deal with this crisis. Here you have, I just want to stop and look at what is the end goal. So before we proceed, what are they guiding these children toward? And we're going to watch George H.W. Bush give a really good summary.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
So there you go, a world order in which a credible United Nations is going to use its military forces, aka peacekeeping role, to bring about the vision of the UN's founders. And we know quite a bit about the UN's founders. You had mass murdering butcher Joseph Stalin on the one side, and we sent over a guy called Alger Hiss, and they liked him so much they made him the chairman, the Secretary General of the founding conference and of the United Nations. And a few years later, we put him in prison because he was a spy, an agent of Joseph Stalin. So why we would want to replace the vision of our founders with the vision of the UN's founders is something I think George H.W. Bush ought to explain. But obviously, this is not a partisan issue.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
So they all seem to agree we need a new world order, right? And they told us a lot about what this new world order is going to look like. It's not going to be pleasant if you love liberty, if you love your country, if you love limited government, if you don't think babies ought to be slaughtered with tax money, and on, right? All these issues we care about, we need to recognize we're going to lose on every single one if these people continue to indoctrinate our children. And the UN is actually bragging about this. This, I think, is pretty remarkable. They've come out of the closet, so to speak, no pun intended, on these issues. They have a number of tools that they're using, and I think two of the crucial ones that I just want to spend a moment on before we go on to actually see what's happening in the schools. One is UN Agenda 21. This was created by the same George H.W. Bush we just saw back in 1992. He signed it. Nancy Pelosi was all on board, wanted to bring this into every element of the federal government, and then more recently UN Agenda 2030. We're going to break these down a little bit, and we're going to see that even these globalists within the UN recognize how crucial education is to all this. So this is a direct quote from Agenda 21. You know, a lot of the fake news says Agenda 21 is a conspiracy theory. I think they need to consult the dictionary and then the UN's website. It's not a conspiracy. It's not secret. You can read the report on the UN's website. And it's certainly not a theory. Again, you can read the report on the UN's website. And so this is policy documents that are meant to guide governments around the world. And here in Chapter 36, they tell us, quite obviously, they understand, just like Hitler did, education is critical for promoting sustainable development. Environmental and development education needs to be incorporated as an essential part of learning. They say both formal and non-formal education are indispensable to changing people's attitudes. Then they even talk about bringing spirituality education into this. So the UN, they recognize that if they want their agenda to succeed, they need to educate the children to accept that agenda. And they're very clear about this. They're very transparent about this. This is a UN book that was actually produced for little children. I have a copy of this book. This is one of the pages. You see these pagan, I guess they're Hindu gods or something. They're looking very alarmed. There are all these children falling from the sky with the storks. And in this book, right next to this page, it says, "The earth groans every time it registers another birth." So babies are bad, right? The earth groans when more babies come. Now, if you're a Christian or a Jewish person, if you believe the Bible, God said, be fruitful, go multiply. And I think this gives you some understanding of the UN's ideology of sustainable development. People are bad. We need less people. Individual liberty is bad. We need less liberty. Nation states are bad. All of these things that we consider essential, that are foundational to the United States, to our freedoms, are all bad in the eyes of the UN Sustainable Development ideologists. And this is the agenda that they're demanding be taught to your children in every government school all over the planet. Here they tell you in Agenda 2030, this is a direct quote from the document. You can also read this on the UN's website. I suggest that you do. It's a lot shorter than Agenda 21. And they say that children are critical agents of change. Right? Did you know your children were critical agents of change? Well, now you do. And they're going to use their, they're going to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation of a better world. And better world, of course, in UN speak, means a world in which the sustainable ideology reigns supreme. I can stop and tell you a little bit about the sustainable ideology. I actually went down to the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro in 2012. And boy, was that an experience. The head of this conference was actually a Chinese communist. His name was Xia Zhakung, infamous for awarding awards to the generals who slaughtered the students at Tiananmen Square. And it was just on display. Humans are bad. Communism is good, right? They had this poster all over. I'll show it to you later in the presentation. A sick earth, and the doctor comes and says, "I know your problem. You have humans, right? Humans are this disease that needs to be eradicated. The doctor's going to come cure the poor planet of the disease it has, these humans." On Agenda 2030, Ban Ki-moon, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations at the time, told us this is the Declaration of Interdependence, a direct swipe at the United States, and of course our Declaration of Independence, which points out the self-evident truth that we're all created equal, we're all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. The head of the UN General Assembly at the time, Peter Thomas, said it was the master plan for humanity. The Communist Chinese government bragged that they played a crucial role in developing Agenda 2030. And of course, this document refers to the Earth as Mother Earth. All right, so Mother Earth, we need to do it all for the children and for Mother Earth. Again, children are critical agents of change, and Goal 4 actually deals exclusively with education. They say that by 2030, all learners need to acquire the knowledge and the skills necessary to promote sustainable development. So it's not enough for them to just be submitting to sustainable development or accepting sustainable development. They need to be so brainwashed that they need to go out and promote this UN ideology that flies in the face of everything that our country is based upon. And it goes on and on and on. They got all kinds of stuff. Here we're going to see a UNESCO propaganda video dealing with these things.
Achieve sustainable development that protects our planet and builds a more inclusive, equal, and peaceful world without education. We can't. Sustainable development begins with education. Put global education first.
So there you go. It's a very short clip, and I've got tons of these. If we ever do an extended version, I'll show you more. But these are UN propaganda films telling us that the way to achieve their little world order with sustainable development, I call it sustainable tyranny, at the heart of it is to brainwash the kids. So they're telling us this openly. Now, if we want to see how this works, I just picked one example, and I could have given you many. But let's look at what happened with the LGBT agenda. For older Americans, if you were around in the 80s or the 90s, even into the early 2000s, you probably remember that sodomy was a crime across much of the United States until the Supreme Court struck it down. But in the 90s, the LGBT activists got into the government schools and started indoctrinating the children on these. And I don't care what you think about the LGBT issue. It's not important right now. I just want to show you how this all works. So let's take a look at this video.
Homosexual activists believe that elementary school children should be taught that homosexuality is a natural and normal variation of human sexuality. One homosexual teacher steers his kids to the politically correct view of marriage.
Let me tell you quickly the background. Today, the law says that if you're the same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges for a few minutes. What I'm going to give each of you is a sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, and that it goes against what a family is. Other people think that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to 2 adults to decide what they want to do. What do you think the answer to these questions are? Should gays be allowed to marry? Should they not?
I don't see why they shouldn't. I don't see why they shouldn't get married. I think gay people should get married. Guys, if they love someone, let them get married. I know. Let's say if Andres wanted to get married to Eric. I'm just doing this, but I am the judge, and I'm saying, no, you 2 can't get married. I don't care if you love them. You can't get married. How do you think you guys would feel? Mad? Yeah, exactly. So you think that they can't get married? I don't know.
And so there you have it. 20 years later, 20 years after they started going into the schools with this LGBT propaganda, teaching the kids that the courts should overturn 1 man, 1 woman marriage as God designed it, as the founders intended, as every state that voted on this decided, we ended up with homosexual marriage. And of course, much worse, as we're going to see going forward. Now, the new thing that they're really pushing hard in the schools is this man-made global warming hypothesis. And as we'll see, this is also critical to advancing their agenda. The UN is literally claiming that the gas that you exhale is pollution that needs to be regulated and taxed by the United Nations. They're literally claiming that CO2, you exhale about 2 pounds of it every day on average, is a toxic pollution that the UN needs to regulate. So let's see what the UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, says about this.
Climate change is one of the biggest challenges of our time. It concerns every one of us. Today, our planet hosts 7 billion people. Already now we use far more resources and produce far more greenhouse gases than it can handle. If we do not act now, how can our planet meet the needs of 9 billion of us in 2050? The increased production of greenhouse gases that has changed the Earth's climate and atmosphere is of great concern to scientists, politicians and citizens around the world. Global warming has caused dramatic reductions in seasonal sea ice. Storms, floods and droughts are intensified by global warming. Although developing countries have contributed the least to climate change, they suffer the most. Small island states in the Pacific are threatened to disappear due to rising sea levels. It's likely that the number of climate refugees will increase in the future. To ensure that the rights and needs of current and future generations around the world are met, we have to deal with climate change now.
So there you have it. They're terrifying the kids. They are terrorizing the kids, teaching them that the world is over, their parents are going to die if we don't surrender our money and our freedom to the United Nations to save us from this alleged global warming. If you want more on global warming, I encourage you to go check out a lot of the interviews we've done at the New American. We've even interviewed scientists from the UN IPCC saying that this is all garbage, the hypothesis is fake, the seas are not rising, the Earth is not warming because of CO2 emissions. It's all a big hoax. But imagine, you saw what they did with the LGBT agenda. Now, what do you think is going to be the result of teaching the kids that the gas they exhale is toxic pollution? Well, give it another generation and they will be more than willing to surrender the sovereignty of our country, our individual liberties, our free market economy to the UN to save us from this boogeyman. And you don't have to take my word for it about what's going on in the schools. Charlotte Iserbyt is actually a friend of mine. She was a senior advisor on education during the Reagan administration. And once she realized what was going on, once she got into the Department of Education and started seeing these documents, she said, oh my goodness, they're dumbing down the kids on purpose. They're trying to merge us with the Soviet Union. They're merging our educational system so that they do the same thing. She blew the whistle, she leaked the documents, wrote this book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, that really exposes it all. And here you can watch her explain what the real purpose of government education is in the United States today.
You think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic? The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students.
And we can also listen to some of the people who created this system. This is Shirley McCoon, who was actually involved in the writing of national standards. She's given a speech at the National Governors Association explaining that the schools are no longer there just to teach children how to read and write and do these things. They're there for social change purposes. They're transforming our society. So let's take a listen.
Fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society. What is happening in America today and what is happening in Kansas and the Great Plains is not simply a chance situation and the usual winds of change. What it amounts to is a total transformation of our society. We have moved into a new era.
There you go. The schools are undertaking a total transformation of our society.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is and then move back and figure out what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of schools.
So if that sounds like the rhetoric of central planners from China or Cuba, good, because that is the rhetoric from these types of people, right? They're talking about figuring out what's going to happen in the future and then preparing your children for that future, rather than just educating them and giving them the basic tools to educate themselves. So this is very dangerous, right? We're seeing this now manifested all over the place. I think the sexualization that's going on, the perversion, the confusion being pushed on our children is a very good example of this. So we'll just take a quick look at a few of the things going on. At Chasco Middle School, they had a girl who was, transgender, pretending to be a boy, and she insisted on going into the boys' locker room and the boys' showers for PE. And the male PE teacher was ordered to go in there and watch this, watch an underage girl shower and change and these types of things after PE. And he said, well, I can't do that. That's an underage girl. We used to put people in jail for doing that kind of thing. And yet here this teacher was being forced to do it. He refused, obviously. He said, I'm not going to go look at a minor girl naked. And what did they do? They threatened to fire him. They threatened to have his teaching credentials taken away so he could never work as a teacher again. They accused him of all sorts of things. They tried to destroy him. And this is just one school, and this is happening all across the country. In Minnesota, the public schools took an underage boy to go have his genitals surgically removed as part of a sex change operation, not only without the consent of the parents, but with the explicit understanding that the parents did not accept that, would not tolerate that. And now there's a federal lawsuit going on. The mom is suing, but it's a little bit too late, right? The boy's not going to get his genitals back. In California, they're pushing this on 5-year-old children. They have a new health education framework teaching the kids that there are infinite genders. They can be any gender. That doctors have to guess what gender children are because children can't talk, babies can't talk yet, so they have to assign randomly a sex at birth. This is the kind of craziness that's happening. Here is an assistant superintendent in California explaining why they're teaching the kids about pedophilia and pederastry.
Answer me why you're teaching pedophilia in school to ninth graders.
Teaching what?
Pedophilia, pederasty, right here.
Pederasty, as I discussed with you before, twice in my office when you come to view the materials, I've explained to you that this is done because we are talking about historical perspectives of how gender relations and different types of sexual orientations have existed in history. So this is something,
a man and a boy is a sexual orientation.
Something that's occurred in history, and so this is really important for us to include.
Notice they referred to pedophilia as a sexual orientation. Project the lines out and you'll see they're trying to enshrine sexual orientation into federal law. Pedophiles are a sexual orientation. Now churches are supposed to not discriminate based on sexual orientation. Do you want a pedophile running your Sunday school? Well, this is what's coming, guys. This is what they're teaching your children in the government schools. This is part of the drag queen story hour, they call it. This is invading public libraries and government schools across the country. What you see here is a man dressed up as a woman with demon horns coming out of his head, reading LGBT stories to children about homosexual worms and homosexual families and marriages and things like this. And to think, sodomy was a crime less than 20 years ago, right? But we saw what they were doing in the schools in the 1990s. We saw how that changed the attitudes of the children so that now they could get away with completely redefining or even undefining marriage to the point where now we have men in drag queen costumes and demon suits reading LGBT stories to little children in schools. This came from Colorado. For a career day literacy event, they brought in a drag queen named Jessica Lahore. I kid you not. When I reported on this on one of my education blogs, this mob of drag queens and transgenders and these things started coming after me, and apparently it's intolerant to suggest that little children in middle school should not be exposed to this, Jessica Lahore. It is what it is, right? This is what's happening. I want you to take a look at this, and there's a lot of this data now. In California, where the brainwashing has been most extreme, according to a UCLA survey, more than 25%, more than 1/4 of California children are now gender non-conforming. So boys who don't identify as boys, girls who don't identify as girls. I was a kid not that long ago, and there was nobody who was gender non-conforming. It wasn't a thing. I never in my entire childhood met a person who was gender non-conforming. Never, right? Throughout my entire time in school. And that wasn't that long ago, right? It was like 10 years ago I was still in school. So this is California. In Sweden, the number of transgender children is doubling every year. There are now surveys that show that 50% of American young people identify as some LGBTQI, all these different letters. And this is the trend, right? This is going to keep getting worse. Parents, do you want your children being exposed to this kind of stuff? UNESCO is now advocating this at the global level. Again, we come back to UNESCO. We're going to spend a lot of time on UNESCO today. UNESCO has this new global sex education standards. They want to teach masturbation to 5-year-olds. They want 12-year-old children to understand why abortion needs to be legal and safe and accessible and tax funded. They want to explain gender confusion to kindergarten children. They want to promote homosexuality to kindergarten children. They want to promote fornication to young children. This is the stuff they're teaching kids, 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, and UNESCO wants this for the globe. They say this is an evidence-based policy, and their evidence comes from Planned Parenthood, the largest murderer of unborn children in the United States. So if you want evidence from Planned Parenthood, I suggest you need to look elsewhere. This is some of what's going on in the classroom today. I don't care if you like Obama or not, but is it appropriate to force little kids to sing homage to the leader in a government school? I'm sorry, but this is the kind of stuff we saw in Nazi Germany. This is the kind of stuff we saw in the Soviet Union. You don't force little children to chant praises of a government official who they don't know anything about, who they're way too young to have an opinion on. This is just wrong. And of course, Obama is the one who pushed the Common Core standards on our schools all across the country. And I want to just take a quick look at this so you understand the scope of the dumbing down that's happening. They put 2 subject matter experts on the Common Core Validation Committee. One of them was Sandra Stotsky. I know her, I've interviewed her, I serve on a board with her. And she was the only English language expert who was put on this committee. She said Common Core reduces literary study. It's going to reduce the opportunity of children to develop critical thinking skills. They were written hastily by people who didn't care how poorly they were written. And this is the only English language expert they put on the Common Core Validation Committee. The members of this committee have described themselves to me as a rubber stamp committee. She refused to sign off, and so her name was removed. This is one of the people who helped write the reading standards. I spoke to her not long ago, Dr. Louisa Moats. And she said there's language in Common Core that's not based in reality. It doesn't reflect how children learn how to read. So she was very upset with the reading component. We're going to talk more about reading today and what's happening, why we have an illiteracy crisis in the schools. But this is from the people who were involved with it. Okay, here's Dr. James Milgram, the only mathematics expert on the Common Core Validation Committee. Says the math standards are written to reflect very low expectations. They are as non-challenging as possible. Extremely serious failings. There are actual errors in the math, right? And so, of course, we should roll this out across the country, right? So he also refused to sign off on the standards, and his name was removed from the list. We have pseudoscience in the classroom, also Common Core. They call it the Next Generation Science Standards, developed by the same people as Common Core. And of course, they push this idea on the children that they came from slime that evolved over millions of years with no God whatsoever, and science proves there's no God. And they push the idea that man's emissions of CO2, which by the way represent a fraction of 1% of all the greenhouse gases naturally in the atmosphere, are destroying the planet and need to be taxed and regulated by the UN. So this is the pseudoscience your kids are learning. Fake history, obviously they're learning that America's founders were evil, that the Constitution was bad, that we need to move into globalism. It's sick what's happening. Here's some of the technology that the Federal Department of Education is rolling out. These all came from the federal government. Here you see a robot. This robot was created with a grant from the federal government to gather mental health data on children in schools. They figured out that kids would give their mental health data more readily to a robot than they would to a person, so they deployed this. Here you've got a facial expression camera, so they'll present some idea to the kids, homosexual marriage, and this camera will will analyze their facial expression, determine what their reaction is, and determine whether there needs to be an intervention to fix their attitudes. So this is the reality of what we're dealing with. They now have in U.S. Department of Education reports, they're admitting that all this data they're gathering is going to help them predict the future behavior and attitudes of the children. It's all going into federal databases that are shared across the federal government, also shared with private companies. This is what's going on in the classroom, folks. They also have values clarification. So you're a Christian parent, you're trying to teach your child right and wrong. You're a Jewish parent, you're trying to teach your child, the 10 Commandments. You don't kill, you don't steal, you don't lie, you don't cheat. And then along come the schools with this values clarification. They figured out this scientific, psychological way to break down children's moral understandings, the values that their parents try to instill in them. It's very, very effective. That's why they do it. So to give you kind of an example, and some of you might have gone through this. I went through this when I was in school. They say, well, you're in a lifeboat, and there's, this lifeboat can hold 8 people, but you have 9 people in the lifeboat. You have a doctor, a lawyer, an Indian chief. Which one are you going to throw overboard and kill so that the rest can survive? So what this does is it creates a situation in the minds of the children of, my parents said we shouldn't kill people, and yet here's a situation where the greater good requires me to kill people. So my parents must be wrong. My church must be wrong. The Bible must be wrong. Morality must be relative. Ethics must be situational. And so you break down the moral understanding of the children, and this is very, very effective. This has a devastating impact on children, and so we shouldn't be surprised that UNESCO has global guidelines for how to implement these values clarifications programs in classrooms around the world to support social justice and so on. And they actually make quite clear that the goal is to break down moral absolutes in the minds of the children. They never suggest to the children, hey, how about instead of killing somebody, what if one of us just takes turns swimming on the side, right? We'll just rotate. Why? Well, this option wasn't presented to them, and they're little children. They don't know any better. So they come away thinking, I guess we have to kill people for the greater good. Now, If these schools were giving our kids a great education, maybe we could overlook all the brainwashing and the indoctrination, but the reality is they're not. We have a catastrophe going on right now in terms of the education of our children. This is from the government's own data, so I don't want you to take my word for it. You can believe the government if you do that. They say more than 2/3 of 8th graders are below proficiency in math. And these are on, the dumbest of the dumbed down standards you can imagine. They say 1/3 of 8th graders are proficient in English. Just 1/4 of high school seniors are proficient in math. You literally have a situation where millions of kids in America are graduating, getting high school diplomas, and they cannot read what's written on those high school diplomas. In 1993, the federal government studied the literacy of adult Americans. They found that about half was either illiterate or so close to being illiterate we might as well bunch them all together. In 2003, another study by the federal government found that about half of Americans either could not read or could barely read, so we can lump them all together. They are, functionally illiterate. Washington, D.C., the situation's even worse. According to a state education agency report, more than 2/3 of the adult residents of Washington, D.C. cannot read at all. Right? They are functionally illiterate. Now, a lot of these kids, and most of these people, have high school diplomas. Most of them were educated in a government school. Why can't they read? Is it a mystery how to teach reading? Of course not, right? We're going to talk about why in just a moment. About 1/3 of high school seniors are proficient in reading, again, according to the Federal Department of Education. So this came from Ronald Reagan's administration. They did a study on the educational system. They said the educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and a people. There you have it, right from the government. Our future as a nation and as a people is under threat. They went on to say that if a foreign power had imposed this educational catastrophe on us, we might have viewed it as an act of war, and I would agree. We have a lot of data about the education level of Americans 200, 300 years ago. Turns out they were a lot better educated than Americans today. But here's an interesting fact from this gentleman, DuPont de Nemours, who did a study of literacy in America. Said most young Americans can read, write, and cipher. They can do math. Not more than 4 in 1,000 are unable to write legibly, even neatly. I'll confess I can't write legibly or neatly. And the reality is most Americans today can't either. And yet, back then, before we wasted more than $1 trillion on a government school system, people could read. Why? And we have a lot of data showing this to be true, right? Our founding fathers commented on this. Think about the Federalist Papers. These were addressed to common Americans. These were addressed to farmers and merchants. And yet, today, even college-educated people can't understand those. So we had a very different educational system in early America. We had most of the early education was done at home by the parents. That's where most children learned how to read. They used very simple tools, the New England Primer, the original blueback speller, cheap, extremely effective. This is how kids used to learn how to read. We didn't spend gazillions of dollars with reading interventions and reading experts and PhDs and this and that and the other. You just use a simple little tool that you could get at the corner store to teach your kids to read, and it was incredibly effective. Most of our founders were homeschooled for most of their lives. Some of them had a couple years of formal schooling in a private academy or with a tutor or a church helping them out, and then some of them went on to do a couple years at universities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, back when they were, good Christian universities. And yet these are the men who created our Constitution, who created the freest, most prosperous, most amazing nation in history. Do we see a lot of men who are this well versed today in history, in Latin, in Bible, in Greek, in politics? Yeah, of course we don't, right? I mean, think of our current crop of political leaders in Washington, D.C. and compare them, right? So what happened? Well, we have a number of individuals created this government school system that we have today. One of the key people was this gentleman here, Horace Mann. He was a socialist. He was interested in getting the Bible out of the schools. And he was appointed the first ever Education Secretary of Massachusetts, which was the first state to ever have a Secretary of Education. This was in 1837. He had gone to Prussia. The Prussian dictatorship had come up with this new idea that, hey, why don't we have the government educate children? And why don't we force parents to hand the children over to the government to be brainwashed by the state for the state, right? And we saw what happened in Germany after that, World War I, and then of course they all became Nazis and crazy stuff. But Horace Mann thought, hey, that's a good idea. Let's have the government educate all the children. He thought it would equalize all men, to take a direct quote from him. He also pushed this quackery called the whole word method, which was really the beginning of our illiteracy crisis in the United States. It became an absolute disaster. And so very, very early on, all the schoolmasters in Boston said, oh, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Sorry, that is not supported by sound reasoning. It's not going to happen anymore. Kids aren't learning how to read. We're just going to go back to teaching reading the old way, right? And so just, a very quick breakdown of this. We have a phonetic alphabet where every letter represents one or more sounds, and you combine those together, and that's how you read a word. That's how you teach reading. Horace Mann had this idea. It wasn't his idea. He borrowed it from a reverend who was very well-intentioned, wanted to teach deaf children. He thought, why don't we try that on the regular children, the non-deaf children in the public schools? Well, it was a catastrophe, and that's because children don't learn to read whole words, right? If you were reading Chinese, then you would read a whole word, but in our system of reading, we have phonetic letters that represent sounds, and so that is how you have to learn how to read. So in the whole word method, you would look at a fish, you would see, fish, and you remember that this series of squiggly lines spells fish. Around the same time, we had this guy in Europe, in Germany, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels came up with the Communist Manifesto, and they loved this idea of government educating the children. And I think a lot of us in America, we just take it for granted that government should run an education system because it's all we know. We grew up with this, and it's just part of our reality, our status quo today. But this was a revolutionary idea back then. The idea that the government would force parents to give their children to the government to be educated. And of course, there's a very strategic reason why Karl Marx wanted to do this. He wanted to brainwash the kids to bring about this new communist utopia without private property, without freedom, without God, etc. John Dewey picked up where Horace Mann left off. He had gone to the Soviet Union. He visited the mass murdering dictatorship there. He loved what Vladimir Lenin was doing. He actually pointed to a U.S. book called Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. It was kind of a fiction book about a socialist, communist America in the year 2000. And he said, that's what I want for the United States. He wanted a new social order. And he had this wild plan to hijack the government school system that was already, starting to become the norm across much of the United States, thanks to Horace Mann, and use it to dumb down and indoctrinate the kids. One of his quotes, Dr. Sam Blumenfeld and I wrote a book that exposes all this in great detail, and we actually reprinted this essay because it's so important. It's called The Primary Education Fetish, and John Dewey said, change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So he knew that parents and teachers would never go for this if they could, if they understood what was happening. John Dewey was also a self-styled educator. He got millions of dollars from the Rockefellers back when that was real money. He wrote a book called Democracy in Education, in which he explained that the process through which we're going to obtain the needed transformation, from a free capitalistic Christian republic to a totalitarian collectivist, slave state, was going to happen through education, right? So he was very clear about this. Now, the reading disaster, John Dewey resurrected this quackery from Horace Mann, the whole word method, because he knew it would promote illiteracy on a massive scale. He was absolutely right. When you can't read your Bible, you can't read the Constitution, you can't read a history book, you can't read anything, and so you depend on your superiors, your betters, to tell you. And now this quackery has been exposed over and over and over again since then. Even Dr. Seuss, right, who was actually hired to do a whole word book, some of you have probably read it, he says, I think killing phonics is one of the greatest causes of illiteracy in this country. Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, who I worked with, blew the lid off this in 1973 with his book, The New Illiterates. Rudolf Flesch blew the lid off this in 1955 with his book, Why Johnny Can't Read. And so a lot of people have known about this. There's been a battle going on for generations, but now we have scientific proof that it does massive damage. This is from Dr. Stanislas Dehaene from France. He has used neuroscanning and brain imaging, modern technology, to point out that this quackery, this whole word method, does massive damage to children. And yet, under Common Core, we have these sight words in every kindergarten classroom across America today. You can actually read the standard right here, read common high-frequency words by sight, and then they have lists of it. They send the kids home with flashcards. They're supposed to memorize whole words. This sets them up to have a reflex where instead of sounding out the words, they try to see what it is just by sight, and this leads to disaster. UNESCO wants this for the whole globe, right? They have this reading guide. They say children should be able to learn a sight vocabulary, right? So this is why we now have an illiteracy crisis, not just in the United States, but around the world. John Dewey was also a religious humanist, is the word he used to describe his religion. He was one of the authors and signers of the very first Humanist Manifesto. Now, I encourage you to read the whole thing if you have time, but we'll just look at the first two tenets because they're so important. The first tenet, this is directly from the document, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. The second point is that man evolved through a continuous process. Now, if you compare what Dewey said in his religious handbook to what the Bible says, God says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, not self-existing, not created, right? So John Dewey was very strategically taking aim at the very first words of the Bible. If you go on and read the rest of the Humanist Manifesto, you'll see it also calls for getting rid of the profit motive, getting rid of private property, basically the Communist Manifesto wrapped up under religious guises. And even if you're not a Christian, this has huge implications for your liberty, right? The foundation of our liberties in the United States and around the world is the self-evident truth that our God created us equally and that He endowed us with inalienable rights. If you take God out of the picture, there is absolutely no reason why you should have inalienable rights, because you don't, right? You're just a box of chemicals randomly walking around with no meaning whatsoever. So the founders did not view this as a religious statement. They viewed it as a self-evident truth. And yet today they don't teach this in classrooms because that would be a religious statement to teach you that God created you and that God endowed you with inalienable rights. And yet that is the foundation of our liberties, right? They said the purpose of government is to protect those God-given rights, and yet here we have these religious humanists teaching our children that there is no God, and therefore, how could you possibly have inalienable rights? They were very open about their agenda, right? Here's another one of the big humanists, C.F. Potter, said education is the most powerful ally of humanism, so every public school is a school of humanism. What can your Sunday school do in one day for 1 hour when we have the kids for 5 days a week, right? And the answer is absolutely nothing. Then the Supreme Court came in 1962, they banned prayer. 1963, they banned the Bible. Ironically, they pointed to the First Amendment, and of course the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And as far as I know, the New York State Assembly is not Congress. Your local school district is not Congress. The First Amendment was written to prevent the federal government from interfering in the states, in the local governments, on matters of religion, not to prevent them from having prayer in schools. The founders would have been absolutely horrified by a Bible ban in school, and yet this was cited to make that happen. At least one Supreme Court justice understood what was happening. It didn't lead to neutrality with respect to religion, but to the establishment of a religion of secularism, or humanism, if you will. Humanism treats man as a god, right? And you know, if you go back to Genesis, God says something about that, right? The snake says, oh, you could be as gods, right? So we've heard this lie before. Anyways, the 10th Amendment, what role does the federal government have in education? The short answer is none. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the states or the people. And in fact, at the time of the founding, at the time of the Constitution, several states actually had established religions. If the founders intended to ban states from having any religious influence whatsoever, you think they might have addressed that little topic, right? Of course, the UN wants to make this global. The UN wants every school in the country, every school in the world to be teaching these ideas. Article 26 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights says education needs to be compulsory and that education shall, notice they don't say may, it shall further the activities of the United Nations. You also have we've talked about UNESCO several times. UNESCO was literally founded for this purpose. It's the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and it was founded to bring all this about. The very first Secretary General, Julius Huxley, said the purpose was political unification in some sort of world government. They put out a series in 1949 where they said that schools must be used to combat family attitudes. In 1990, they had this World Conference on Education. This was held in Jomtien in Thailand. Article 10 said that the basic learning needs and the basic learning content required by all human beings is a common and universal human responsibility. See, and here we thought it was the responsibility of our local school district or the mom and dad or, whoever. Here they're saying it's the UN's responsibility, right? They say all children must be subject to the same standards of learning. That's interesting. So we need a global standard for our learning, right? They came together again 10 years later in Senegal. They said all governments must implement integrated strategies which recognize the need for changes in attitudes, values, and practices. They also say that these changes are required. Notice they're talking about attitudes and values and behavior, right? They're talking about the need to change these things.
Education must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
So there you have the head of the United Nations at the time, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who calls the UN the Parliament of Humanity, saying that education should not just teach the kids to read and write, it needs to nurture global citizens, right? And here we thought they were going to be U.S. citizens. Well, apparently not. The UN had a global education action plan. It's going to promote the integrated development of the whole person, including their spirituality. And here you thought, wait, I thought separation church and state, that's what the Supreme Court said. Well, the UN wants to deal with their spirituality too. Education must advance the cause of global citizenship, straight from the UN's document, and children must understand their responsibility to protect the planet and to promote what the UN considers to be the common good, which, if you value freedom, I guarantee you have a very different idea of what the common good means. Here was the recently departed head of UNESCO, an actual communist from the Bulgarian Communist Party, massacred hundreds of thousands of people. And she says, this was actually arrived in a press release right into my inbox, said, we have the collective duty to empower every child with the right foundations, with the knowledge, the values, and skills to shape the future as responsible global citizens. And you can see videos of her talking like this. They also, the UNESCO has this whole Education for Sustainable Development program where all education must promote sustainable development. This is the poster I mentioned earlier. This was all over the place at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio. And here you see Earth, right? He's obviously very sick and very upset. And the doctor comes along and he says, I'm sure you have humans, right? So humans are a disease under this ideology that the United Nations calls sustainable development. And this is interesting because they say education all has to be for sustainable development. This is what they themselves say. I pulled this right off of UNESCO's website. More highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who have lower incomes. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. So do you suppose they want well-educated little children out there? Well, no, right? They told us they would increase the threat to sustainability. And you think, well, that's what the UN is doing. That doesn't affect us here in America. Oh, yes, it does. Right? This man here is Arne Duncan. He was Obama's Secretary of Education for 7 years. He gave a speech in front of UNESCO. You can find it on the U.S. Department of Education's website still today. And he said, UNESCO is the global partner of the U.S. government in creating green global citizens. He quoted a communist terrorist. He said, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. And he also said, education is a global public good unconstrained by national boundaries. So, we thought our local school boards were in charge of education. He's saying it's not even national governments anymore. Now it's a global public good. And who else could deliver global public goods except the United Nations? The UNESCO is in our classrooms, right? Duncan, this is all on the U.S. Department of Education's website, says we must advance the sustainability movement through education. So the U.S. government is working to build the science of sustainability. Notice they call their crazy ideology science into the curriculum, starting in kindergarten and extending all the way through until students graduate from high school. So these people aren't messing around, right? The UNESCO also has what they call a World Core curriculum, and as we'll see, the resemblance with the Common Core name is more than coincidental. These were written by a guy called Robert Mueller. He was the UN Assistant Secretary General, and he said that the World Core curriculum should steer our children toward global citizenship, Earth-centered beliefs, socialist values, collective mindset, which is becoming a requirement for the 21st century workforce. And he also told us, if you get the teacher's manual for the World Core curriculum, the underlying philosophy upon which the Robert Mueller School, the World Core curriculum, is based will be found in the teachings set forth in the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Juhualhu Kul. And for those of you who don't know who this is, this Tibetan teacher was not an actual Tibetan teacher. It was they called him an ascended master, these spiritual entities that Alice Bailey claimed she channeled. They would write these weirdo books for her, like Education in the New Age. And any Christian, I think, would instantly recognize this as clearly demonic. Alice Bailey went on to go found the Lucifer Publishing Company. So it'll give you a little bit of a hint about where she's coming from. And the guy who wrote the World Core curriculum says it's based on her teachings. So, you can put two and two together and realize that we've got a real problem here. Common Core, of course, is a crucial part of all this. In 2015, UNESCO bragged that in 1990 there were only 12 learning assessments on a national standards, and by 2013 the number had increased to 101. One of those, of course, being the Common Core. Bill Gates, who signed an agreement with UNESCO in 2004 on behalf of Microsoft, saying that we agree to the UNESCO Constitution, we're going to globalize education, we're going to create global standards, global curricula. He went on to found and fund Common Core. $2 billion with a B of his own money dumped into Common Core. And it was so great that he obviously puts his children in an elite private school where they brag that they don't use Common Core, right? That's how great it was. That's how you know it's great. Here you can watch a video of them bragging about the globalist nature of these standards.
Up until now, it's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. Is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis as prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too. Now we know how we're doing compared to just about everyone. So even though local communities will still design their own curriculum, with the same rules, everybody can compete on the same kind of staircase.
And here, you know, people think, oh, well, Trump is in office now. None of this is relevant anymore. Well, yes, it is, right? Here's Betsy DeVos down in Argentina at the G20 ministerial meeting, and she signed an agreement on behalf of our government saying, among other things, we commit to facilitating the internationalization of education. We get to the polls again, right? And we can see very clearly what's happening here, folks. 18 to 29-year-olds in 2018, 51% had a positive view of socialism. 45% had a positive view of capitalism. Obviously, they haven't been to Cuba, they haven't been to Venezuela, they haven't been to North Korea, they didn't go to the Soviet Union, they didn't go to China, so they really have no idea what they're talking about, but they're being brainwashed. Where do you think they're getting these ideas, right? They've been brainwashed in their schools to believe that socialism will be the solution to all our problems. Now, if you look, the numbers are getting more and more extreme, and this trend is going to continue. We also have young Americans leaving the churches in massive numbers, right? Studies that have been done show that something like 80% of Christian children who go through a 12-year program of government brainwashing called Education are going to leave their churches, right? Our churches are not going to survive with these kinds of numbers if this continues. Here's a graph of the religiously unaffiliated in the United States from 1976. You see it was maybe 7%. To 2015, now we're up at almost 25%, and you can see this number's rising like a rocket, right? And even a lot of the people who still say, oh, I'm a Christian, you know, they obviously don't have a biblical worldview. They believe the religion of humanism, they just don't know it. Here you have another graph, more statistics. So here's a Protestant. You know, America was essentially founded by Protestants, and so this is way on the way down. The number of Catholics has stayed relatively steady only because of the mass immigration from Latin America. But here you have those who believe in nothing massively on the increase, right? From the 1970s when it was about 5-6%, all the way on up to today where it's approaching 1/4 of our children, right? And this is going to continue happening as long as we continue letting the government educate so-called our children. Now, can we reform this, right? Because I know a lot of you out there are like, well, that's terrible. I guess I better run for school board or maybe even state legislature, right? Well, the reality is you cannot reform something that was a bad idea from the start, right? The government schools are doing exactly what the founders, what the architects of this system intended for them to do. They are brainwashing the kids, they are dumbing down the kids, they are sexualizing the kids, and they are preparing the kids to move into what George H.W. Bush described as a new world order. And they brag about this, right? This appeared in The Humanist magazine by John Dunphy. Said, I'm convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged in the public school classroom by teachers that correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith. And here we were told that the government schools were religiously neutral, right? We're just going to tell the kids that our pseudoscience proves that they evolved from slime and monkeys with no God, and but we're neutral, right? Okay, yeah, right. So anyways, this guy recognized it. He went on to say that the rotting corpse of Christianity will be destroyed by these educators, these proselytizers for their new faith. Now here's one of the guys who was involved again with the creation of the government school system. His name is Orestes Brownson, and he was very, very closely connected with the socialists who created the government school system in America, Robert Owen, people like that. And he ended up defecting. He ended up converting to Christianity and blowing the whistle on what these people were up to. But he said something very interesting. The great object, he said, was to get rid of Christianity. The plan was not to make open attacks on religion, but to establish a system of state, we said national schools, from which religion was to be excluded, in which nothing was to be taught but such knowledge as is verifiable by the senses, and to which all parents were to be compelled by law to send their children. Now, at the time, this was incredibly radical, right? The idea of having the government force parents to hand over their children for brainwashing, anti-Christian brainwashing, and yet this is the reality. These are the people who set up the government school system. It's doing exactly what they wanted it to. It's not broken. You can't fix something that's not broken, right? It's doing exactly what it's supposed to. So, what are our options for fixing this? What are the solutions? I mean, obviously, we need to shut down the Department of Education. I mean, it's clear it's an unconstitutional bureaucracy. It has been a disaster in terms of hijacking control of our education system and imposing all this craziness on us. Here, we talked with Congressman Thomas Massie, who introduced H.R. 899 to shut down the Federal Department of Education. You can see some of his arguments.
The Department of Education was established by Jimmy Carter as a re-election tactic, as a ploy. And it's been part of Ronald Reagan's platform and the Republican platform to eliminate the Department of Education. Because the left understands this is where you win or lose, is in the schools and in the teaching of the children. So I wrote a one-page bill, and it says the Department of Education shall terminate on December 31st, 2018. We're trying to eliminate the department. And some of them get upset at that notion, and then I ask the liberals who want the federal government involved, I say, do you really want President Trump deciding what or how your children learn? And so now you've got a situation where the left has to advocate for President Trump controlling their child's education if they want to keep the Department of Education.
So there you go. Liberals, conservatives, left-wingers, right-wingers, Democrats, Republicans, we should all be united on the idea that we don't want President Trump or President Obama or President Clinton or any of these other people deciding what and how our children should learn. But the reality is, even shutting down the Department of Education, as necessary as that is not going to get us out of this problem. The reality is, if we continue to allow the government to educate our children in partnership with the United Nations, we're going to lose it all. We're going to lose every political battle in the upcoming decades and generations. So we have two options. Get out of the public school system in huge numbers, rescue our children, or start getting ready for a future of planetary serfdom. It is going to be very unpleasant, I can guarantee it, unless you're at the top, in which case it'll end up being unpleasant anyway. But again, progressives are winning because they have the children. Government today, not the Bible, has become the arbiter of right and wrong. And a lot of parents realize that this is problematic. They did a survey. They said only 3 out of 10 parents would choose a government school as the first choice for how to get their children educated. So the overwhelming majority of Americans is already realizing that, hey, I don't want the government educating my kids. I'd rather do something else. We have to realize it is not possible for us to retain our freedom, for us to retain our constitutional republic based on Judeo-Christian values, and to have government schools at the same time. It's just not possible. So parents and families, get your kids out. I mean, if there's one takeaway from this, get your kids out of the system. You wouldn't send your kids into a burning building because it might be harmful to their physical well-being. Why would you send them into a building that's going to be harmful for their mental well-being, for their spiritual well-being, and even for their physical well-being? I mean, there's violence, there's drugs, there's abortions, there's this reading quackery that's going to wire their brains wrong. Get your kids out of the schools. And you know, we need a whole of society effort. So I'm talking to parents right now and families specifically, but it's not enough for parents just to get involved here. We need grandparents. Help your children get their children out. Pastors, pastors, you're supposed to be shepherding your flock. You should be warning them about the things that I've talked about today. You saw what's happening in the schools. How can you in good conscience go in front of your congregation and not warn them about this, knowing that the great majority of them are going to leave your church, are going to leave the faith, are going to end up believing all these nonsensical things that are contrary to the Bible, contrary to our founding principles, contrary to the Constitution. How can you keep letting it happen? And you might think, well, there's a public school teacher in my congregation. Chances are very, very good that that public school teacher already knows what's going on in there and is wondering why you're not warning the congregation about it. I know a lot of public school teachers. I know a public school principal. They all homeschool their kids because they know exactly what I'm telling you today. Right? Now, God has a lot to say about education, too. We took out a lot of the slides here, but if you read your Bible, God has a lot to say about education. And one thing that he doesn't say is, take your children, deliver them to Caesar so that Caesar can teach them to be good Romans. right? He doesn't say that at all. In fact, he says, parents, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. That's from Proverbs 22:6. Proverbs also tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's the beginning of knowledge. So if we've expelled God from the classroom, what kind of foundation are you going to be building your child's education on? Now, what do you do now? Okay, to get my kids out. Well, I recommend, one very good option for you to look at is home education. I homeschool my kids. It's a lot of fun. You see smiley little kids there. Homeschooling is awesome. And we have a lot of data to show this. More than 2.5 million American kids today are homeschooled, and it's growing very, very quickly. There's more than 6 million Americans in America today who have been homeschooled at some point in their lives. And the data is incredible. Homeschoolers score on average in the 80th and 90th percentile on standardized tests. And these are the government's own tests. The government schools spend all day, every day preparing the kids for these tests, and still the homeschoolers beat the pants off the victims of the government school victims. Here we have children in government school. When their parent has a master's degree or a teaching certificate, their child will still score 25 to 30% percentile points lower on these standardized tests than a homeschooler child whose parent doesn't even have a high school diploma or has just a high school diploma. That's how skewed this is. And again, homeschoolers put a fraction of the amount of time into it, a fraction of the amount of money to it, and still they do much, much better. We have home educators are now, if you look at the spelling bees, they're almost always being won by homeschool students. If you look at the engineering fairs, the science fairs, homeschooling kids are dominating these, and there's a good reason for that. Universities have now realized this, even the most elite universities, and they're out there actively scouring the country for homeschooled kids. Homeschool kids, and you're thinking, well, what about socialization? Maybe they're going to be smarter, maybe they're going to have better values, but what about their socialization? Turns out we got a lot of data on that too. The source for a lot of this data is the National Home Education Research Institute. They kind of collect all the scholarly articles, the peer-reviewed journals and things on this. They say that the research shows that homeschoolers do better on every index of socialization. The self-image, problem behaviors, peer dependence, communication skills, being able to interact properly with all ages, right? Not just kids of their own age. And of course, they have much better values, right? They don't go out and fornicate. I mean, some do, of course, but by and large, they grow up with a better understanding of right and wrong. And on every level, homeschoolers are doing better. They're doing better in college. They're doing better in getting jobs, doing better in entrepreneurship. Just on every front, they're doing good. Another option is Christian schools, private schools, independent schools, and there's a lot of really good ones. But I got to give you a caveat, not all of them are good. Some of them are basically just little replicas of government schools. They have teachers who were trained to go participate in the government schools. They have principals who are trained in government institutions to work in government schools. So you got to really do your due diligence before trusting a school with your child. I mean, what's more precious than your child, right? You got to do your due diligence. And like Catholic schools, there's a lot of really great Catholic schools. But about half of Catholic dioceses are now using Common Core, right? So this is a big problem. We have about 35,000 private schools in the U.S. They serve about 6 million K through 12 kids. About 25% of all the schools in America are private. 10% of all American students are in private schools, and about 80% of those schools are religious. So there's a lot of options out there for you, parents, if you want to get involved in a good private school, but do your due diligence. Another option is the FreedomProject Academy, which I actually teach at the FreedomProject Academy. I teach some of the brightest high school students in America. And here you can see some of the endorsements.
The last 2 kids we put into a school online. And I wish I had known at the time about FreedomProject Academy.
They put into practice what we talk about in the movie Indoctrination, where we're talking about the problems of the public school system. Well, they provide an alternative, and an amazing alternative.
What you're doing is so incredibly important. The greatest teaching is going to happen outside of the traditional college, high school structure. It's going to be going back to the great roots of Aristotle and Ayn Rand and Adam Smith. So I fully endorse and love what you're talking about.
This past year, my wife and I took the plunge, and we were like, you know what? Let's enroll one of our own children in there. And so our son Noah has been in FreedomProject Academy this year, and it's been amazing.
My band spends probably 200 days a year on the road, and I didn't want to leave my little girl at home, so we searched and searched for a way that she could do school and still be with me. And then we found FPA, and for us, it's absolutely perfect.
The classical education is the way to go. It's the way Thomas Jefferson learned. It's the way Ben Franklin learned.
This is the answer. It's affordable, it's flexible, the parents are loving it, and mostly I think it's the kids. they're coming home and they're saying, I don't hate school anymore. I love school.
They're utilizing the tools of the future while giving an education that is rooted in tradition and timeless moral values. So it's the best of both worlds. It's the best of every world, really. And best of all, no government involved.
So there you go. Freedom Project is a really, really great option for parents out there. They partner with parents. They even partner with churches. So if you're a pastor, you've got your church sitting empty, 5 days, 6 days a week, you can set up a school right there. You don't have to hire any teachers. You don't have to do much of anything. Provide a chaperone. We'll beam the classrooms right into your church. Very, very affordable. Of course, you get a classical education, Judeo-Christian worldview, phonics, real history, real science. It's really, really a great option out there. And there's a lot of other ones too. Just find an alternative that will give your children a real education, not a state-sponsored indoctrination session that will ultimately end up destroying our country. And I think I wanted to close with a couple of quick things. But here, Adolf Hitler, one of the worst mass murderers in the world, who really made use of the government education system better than almost anybody to accomplish his objectives. He said, when an opponent declares, I will not come over to your side, I calmly say, your child belongs to us already. You will pass on. Your descendants, however, now stand in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing else but their new community. So parents, the totalitarians understand very well that whoever molds the minds of the young will own the future. Do you want them to mold the minds of the young, or do you want to do it yourself? Do you want to have freedom and a constitutional republic? If you want those things, we must get the kids out. So we would like to ask you, if this presentation was interesting, if you recognize the importance of this information, go ahead and get a copy of this special report we did on education. I just gave you a really synthesized version of it. You'll get a lot more information that you need to know. You can go to thenewamerican.com/rescuingourchildren. Get yourself one copy. We'll even pay the shipping and handling if you use the promo code EDUCATE19. And what we hope is that you'll get one copy, see how important this is, and then go back and order 100 or 1,000. Get it to your pastor, the elders at your church, your rabbi, your neighbors who might have kids, your children who might have kids in the schools, anybody. We need a Dunkirk operation here. The British Army was stranded on the beaches at Dunkirk, and all of British society came together to rescue them, to prevent the destruction of their society and the destruction of their civilization. They got every little pleasure boat and yacht and fishing ship and merchant vessel. They took it over across the English Channel, grabbed the British Army. Those boys took them back to Britain so they could live to fight another day, and it ended up saving their civilization from absolute destruction. We need to be doing the same thing, but now it's our children who are at risk, not our military. And we need to be on this mission, guys. So thank you so much for listening. I hope this presentation made an impact on you. And if it did, go ahead and get a copy of this special report, Rescuing Our Children. Thank you for listening, and God bless America.